Liberalism, section. Liberalism and radicalism, two different phenomenologies of power. In pronouncing his judgment on England and the United States, de Tocqueville ignored, in addition to colonial peoples or peoples of colonial origin, material living conditions, labor relations, and even, quote, civil laws. Extraneous to his research and analysis of democracy, he declared, was not only the oppression of blacks and Indians, but also the detention of white citizens, vagrants, or poor people summoned to testify in a trial, who were not guilty of any offense. The cult of the, quote, holy thing that was liberty ignored the fate of the excluded in their entirety, whether they lived in the colonies or the metropolis. And, once again, the divergence between liberalism and radicalism, of which Marx and Engels were the critical heirs, is already apparent at an epistemological level. In England, observed Engels, quote, the aiding and abetting of the rich is explicitly recognized even in the law, end quote. Analyzing the English civil laws inherited by the United States, de Tocqueville arrived at the same conclusion, but this fact had political relevance only for Engels. Unlike the authors of the Communist Manifesto, the French liberal compared the worker of the time to the slave, forced to suffer a strict dependency inside the factory, and a degrading, oppressive poverty outside it. But de Tocqueville considered all this foreign to the political sphere proper. It was precisely the drastic restriction of the political, and the consequent exclusion from it of the most profound dimension of the social totality, that prompted Marx's criticisms. From the standpoint of bourgeois society and political theory, he observed in his early writings, social relations, quote, have only a private significance, not any political significance, end quote. In its most developed form, the bourgeois state limited itself, quote, to closing its eyes and declaring that certain real oppositions do not have a political character, that these do not bother it, end quote. While regarded as lacking political relevance, bourgeois social relations and power relations in the factory and society could develop without inhibition or external impediment. Over and above poverty, the reality of the factory, stressed the Communist Manifesto, highlighted the despotism that hung over workers, quote, organized like soldiers and, as privates of the industrial army, placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants, end quote. De Tocqueville's conclusion was scarcely milder. But now the despotism identified and denounced was not this reality, but attempts by political power to change or alleviate it. Against demands to put, quote, the prescience and wisdom of the state in the place of individual prescience and wisdom, the French liberal proclaimed that nothing authorizes the state to interfere in industry, end quote. This was the famous speech of the 12th of September 1848, made to persuade the Constituent Assembly to reject demands for the, quote, right to work that had already been drowned in blood in the June days. De Tocqueville went so far as to attribute to socialist doctrines the regulation and reduction of working hours, the 12-hour day, which therefore became an object of unequivocal condemnation. Likewise dismissed as an expression of socialism and despotism was any legislative measure to alleviate the misery of the, quote, lower classes through rent controls. The French liberal insisted on this intransigently. Immediately after the bloody June days, he did not hesitate to accuse the Interior Minister of being inconsistent and soft. Quote, while Cavaignac and Lamartine fought socialism in the streets, Seignard supported socialist doctrine as regards the 12-hour day, end quote. Some months later, in his draft electoral circular of May 1849, de Tocqueville advertised as a badge of merit the fact that he had voted, inter alia, quote, against the limit it was proposed to place on the working day, against progressive taxation, and finally against the abolition of military substitution." End quote. The last point was no less significant than the others. In de Tocqueville's view, the option the rich man had of hiring a poor man to replace him when it came to performing the duty of military service did not involve an inequality based on wealth and sanctioned by law, even in the face of the danger of death. Rather, it was a contract between individuals, which pertained to the private sphere, and hence did not infringe the principle of legal equality. Even in his capacity as a historian, when reconstructing the history of the collapse of the Ancien Régime, de Tocqueville stuck to this restriction of the political sphere and this peculiar phenomenology of power, which identified dominion and oppression exclusively with the intervention of political power in a private sphere that had been unduly expanded. He drew a terrible picture of the conditions of the popular classes. Beggars and vagrants were sometimes proceeded against, quote, "in the most violent way, with the arrest and condemnation of thousands of people to forced labor without trial. Not much better was the treatment reserved for peasants. While materially and socially they lived in an, quote, abyss of misery and isolation. In terms of civil rights, they were deprived of any protection. They, quote, were constantly arrested in connection with the levies of forced labor or the militia, for begging, for misdemeanors, and countless other minor offenses. In conclusion, the peasants were viewed rather like the Negroes in our colonies." End quote. Was the revolution therefore legitimate and necessary? Such was not de Tocqueville's opinion. France, which with the economists radically criticized and readied itself to overthrow the Ancien Régime, quote, wanted not so much a recognition of the rights of man as reforms in the existing system, end quote. An organ of the titled aristocracy, and hence jointly responsible for the degradation of the peasants to, quote, Negroes. The Parlement were the body which, before unfortunately being dissolved by the Revolution, embodied the whole cause of liberty. In the years preceding the fatal 1789, quote, our judicial institutions were still those of a free people. End quote, and end of section.